Hi everyone, this is Mike McDonough with Stone Door Group, and today I'm going to be demonstrating and going through basically Red Hat Ansible automation platform, showing you some components of the automation platform, and we're going to look at what it takes to install some of the tool set, how it works under the covers. So let's get into it. So first of all, what are we talking about today? Well, Red Hat Ansible Automation Platform is comprised of 6 components: Ansible Engine, Ansible Tower, Automation Hub, what they're calling Automation Analytics, Security Automation, and Network Automation. On this demo, we're going to be focusing on the first 3: Ansible Engine, Ansible Tower, and I'll also give you I'll show you Automation Hub. That's actually a new offering from Red Hat that was just launched this past week. So it's a new cloud-based offering. We'll take a look at that as well. So, purpose of this demo, we're going to show some components again of the automation platform, and we're going to take a look at what a workflow might be if you're replacing legacy scripts, automation tools. Maybe you have open source Puppet, Chef, or whatever have you running in your environment. We're going to take a look at what it takes to get started with Ansible. So why are people looking at Ansible over some of the other tools in the market? These are some of the key points. And this is not a sales presentation, right? We're going to quickly get into the technical side of it, but Ansible does have some real benefits over other tools out there that are available. So as compared to manual automation or manual administration, I should say, Ansible has the power to greatly speed up your admin functions and make them efficient.
Hey, Mike, do you have the ability to share your screen?
I sure do. Excuse me, I know, I apologize those days. All right, it'll make a lot more sense if you can see the slides I've been talking to. Apologies, does that work a little better?
Yes, sir, thank you.
All right, okay, apologize for that. Forgot to hit the button. All right, so why are we talking about Ansible? Why do the businesses, why are they looking at Ansible over other tools and other approaches? So first of all, automation in general has the power to greatly increase the efficiency of your operations and admin staff, reducing repetition. You can build something at Ansible once and use it 10, 100 times, thousands of times potentially. So instead of your admins, manually having to, whether it's on Windows, logging in, clicking around, running PowerShell, running a bash script, that sort of thing, with Ansible, we can automate that and write the code once and reuse that across many systems and environments. Ansible has the power to manage complex deployments. Ansible has the ability to whether you're managing one system, 100, 1,000, tens of thousands of systems, Ansible has the ability to scale. And it has some other benefits in terms of over other tools. There's certainly other tools in the market that claim the same thing. Some of the real differentiators with Ansible implementation is simple. With Ansible, it's easy for users to the language, and I'll show you that in a few moments. The tool set is easy to use. So things to consider with Ansible. So the assumption that we're looking at, kind of our scenario today, is that, and the purpose of this, kind of the background for the demo, let's say, is let's imagine that we have an existing environment, mix of bash scripts, maybe open source Puppet, and we'll take a look at a little bit of that. We're going to focus, though, on Ansible. But imagine we have an existing environment, and coming in, and we've been engaged to replace these tools. So, what are some of the things we're going to look at? What are some of the steps that we're going to take? And then we'll show you actually what it takes to implement Ansible and actually execute some operations tasks. So, as I just said, we're going to walk you through some of the developing an implementation plan, installing configure Ansible Tower, configuring client nodes, both RHEL 7 and Windows Server nodes, and actually show you, actually executing some of the Ansible scripts and jobs on these systems. All right, so without further ado, let's take a look at our environment here. And this demo, the systems are all in Amazon EC2 So this is our environment today. And what we're looking at here, the system's all in the running state. Our Tower system here, we've got a couple of instance launched for Tower, and we've got a couple of RHEL systems and a couple of Windows nodes as well that we're going to be administering. Now, when we look at the a real project in terms of analyzing the environment, there's prep that needs to be done, and that really would boil down to, first of all, taking an inventory. What systems are out there, okay? And that may be, what OS are they running? Is it RHEL? Is it some other version of Linux? Is it Windows? What version of Windows? Also, network devices. Ansible, one of the use cases for Ansible is managing your routers and switches. So, one of the first steps in planning out an Ansible implementation would be to take an inventory of your environment. Once we have an inventory of the environment, the next step would be to start documenting the workflows. What do we have to do to these systems? What are the things like, for example, initial implementation of a new VM? What are those day one tasks that need to be accomplished? What are the day two tasks? Things like potentially managing storage, configuring applications. Once you have an overview of what needs to be accomplished, what we would then proceed to do is actually install Ansible, which we'll do in just a moment, and then start, tackling each of those functions, breaking them down, confirming the one that we have, that the tool set works. Once we know the tool set works, we would then start off with some, fairly simple admin type operations, verifying connectivity, verifying we can, do some basic operations, and then we would typically build up in terms of complexity. And the great thing about Ansible is it's reusable. So once you have a baseline that is working, you can take that and build on top of that. And you'll see that with Ansible in a real implementation. You'll start off with a particular project. Maybe it's, for example, what I'll show you here in just a moment is, configuring Apache, that sort of thing. Well, once your IT staff has that base building block, what's going to happen is they're going to take that building block and extend it. Right, add features to it as new requirements come in. Add on the ability to configure different applications. And in a short order, it's very easy with Ansible to have a suite of tooling built that's capable of managing your environment and really helping your admin staff out. So let's get into installing Ansible. In this terminal window here, this is the Ansible Tower system. All I've done so far is set the host name and run yum update. I have the Ansible install file here, which you download from Red Hat, and the install is straightforward. Extract the installer. And if we look in the directory here, there's one file that we need to configure. It's a file called inventory. Lower. Look at this inventory file here. There's some basic parameters that we need to set before running the install. They're basically setting the passwords. So that's all it takes. Go over here, I've got some version of this already ready to go. Save some typing. If we look at the inventory file, inventory. If we look at the file now, all I've done is set some passwords, and most of these, half the files commented out. So it's really just setting the admin password. This is the password we're going to use to log in initially to the Tower instance. Setting the Postgres database password and a RabbitMQ password. Pretty straightforward. Once that's done, there's a setup program, setup script that we're going to run, setup.sh, and it's as simple as that. We're going to let this run, and while we do this, we're going to take care of some of the client setup tasks that need to be done. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes to run. So we'll go on, and while Tower is installing, we'll go ahead and take care of some of the other prep steps, let's call it. So I've got a couple of Windows nodes here that I'm logged into. Basically, what we're calling App 1 and App 2. And there's a couple of things, all I've done basically from the only modifications to this, first of all, basically I launched a, generic Windows Server 2019 EC2 instance, and I set the host name. That's all that's been done to each of these instances. Beyond that, what we need to do, once we have the host name set, and that certainly, by the way, could be done via Ansible, I just haven't done it in this case, is to add a user. So Ansible, one of the neat things about Ansible is how is the method in which it connects to systems. So instead of installing an agent on each of these Windows systems and on the RHEL or your other Linux systems in your environment, Ansible uses typically SSH, or in the case of Windows, is going to use WinRM to connect to that system. So instead of installing software, an agent that's going to run all the time, all we have to do is make sure that the Ansible Tower or Ansible system that we're using to run our jobs is able to connect to each of the clients and connect as a user and have enough privileges to make the changes that we want to make to the system. So in this case, what we're going to do is add a user. Now, in an enterprise environment, this would typically be done through Active Directory. In this case, we'll do it just via local users, which do, of course, work completely okay if you don't have Active Directory. One thing you want to do when adding this Ansible user is the user's not, you need to address password expiration. So in this case, I'm going to, I'm going to make sure that password never expires. Certainly it is possible to, implement password rotations. In this case, I'm going to make it a little easier on myself. And of course, this is going to be basically a system type account. So I'm going to make sure that the password does not have to be changed at first login. That's the important one. So create the user, close that. And because some of the jobs that we're going to be running require elevated privileges, I'm going to go ahead and add user to the local administrators group. Keep that on our other system. Definitely want to uncheck that box. So in the case of Windows clients, there is one additional step. So, one, Ansible needs to be able to connect to each of these Windows clients, log in as a user with enough privileges to perform the actions that we want to accomplish with our automation. In this case, I've used an administrator role. Certainly, again, real world Active Directory. You can also create new, you would typically create a role, set different, group policies, for example, that sort of thing, lock down the user account. The other setup step that needs to be done is that the Windows clients do not run WinRM by default. That's something that needs to be enabled. So there's a straightforward process to enable a WinRM listener. And what we do is our PowerShell here. And there is a script that's available in GitHub in the Ansible development, in the Ansible repo. So this is, github.com, Ansible project. And there's an example script here, configure remoting for Ansible.ps1. This script is available, and it will set up the WinRM listener for us. Now, I think in an enterprise, if we were going to start, do this in a real world environment, what we would do is we would go ahead, make these changes once, and then we build a new AMI image in EC2. And as we deploy new Windows systems, we would make sure that the WinRM listeners were configured appropriately out of the box. So this doesn't have to be done for each client. Now, we can confirm so that worked correctly. Yeah, so this command shows us our WinRM listeners that are running, and in this case, we have a listener, HTTP port 5985 and HTTPS 5986, or other client. All right, so we've got two WinRM listeners, HTTP and HTTPS. When we look at authentication between Ansible and Windows clients, the other option that's available is that Ansible does support certificates. So, and that again is a more common scenario than what I'm showing today. This is kind of a basic get started approach. This is the most basic version in terms of connecting Ansible to Windows. But in a real world deployment, typically we would set up certificates, sign those certificates, and then make those certificates available to the Ansible control or Ansible Tower system. For today, though, this really is all we have to do. So added a user, added that user to the admin group, and configured the WinRM listener, and we're done. Now, if we go back here, our Ansible Tower install is still running. Should be done in a couple of minutes. So while it's running, let's take a look at some of the environment that we're replacing. So the kind of scripts that we might be replacing, this is a script that, a bash script that is available. This is something published on GitHub, one that I found, an example here. And this script is, you can use it basically to configure virtual host in Apache. So, this bash script certainly is a tool that can be used, to configure Apache. I imagine it works fine. If we look at here, look at the script. So, takes a script of about 123 lines of bash is what it takes to configure virtual host. So again, certainly, about an option. What are the downsides, though, of this script? Well, one, if we want to extend this script, someone's got to know bash. When we look at what it takes to do the equivalent in Ansible, it's much more succinct. A lot of the work, the heavy lifting has already been done for us, so we don't have to write as much code. And you'll see that with Ansible, it is, one of the true advantages of Ansible is the ability to move to an infrastructure as code type model. So, when we run a bash script, the script itself can be static, but what we don't know is that, when an admin runs the script, what arguments did he or she feed to the script? That information is hard to capture. And typically in most environments is lost. On the other hand, what we'll see with Ansible is that everything can be stored in a Git repo or other source code repository, so that and that source code, that configuration that's applied to your infrastructure, you have a record of it, and you have a record, outside that's independent of the infrastructure itself. So we can always go back to the source code repository as the source of truth. And that's very difficult to do when we're just running shell scripts and admins are kind of, doing things ad hoc. One of the other tools that you might see that the Ansible might replace would be Puppet. So I've got a example Puppet control repo. Puppet, modern versions of Puppet at least, certainly tie into, are capable, you can tie Puppet into source code repository. So that's something very similar to Ansible. But with Puppet, it's kind of, there's some pros and cons of each. In my personal opinion, I've recently, went through the exercise of spinning up a Puppet environment, installing Puppet clients, and then I did the same with Ansible Tower. And though I do have more experience with Ansible Tower, more recent experience, I really found that installing Ansible and then actually the process of putting together Ansible jobs is more straightforward, at least in my opinion, than Puppet. Obviously everyone has a different opinion out there, right? But, if we look at Puppet, some things you might find in a Puppet environment would be a Puppet file pulling in various modules. If you've using a more modern implementation of Puppet, using the Hira data, this pulls in data facts about your systems based on information stored in YAML syntax files, and that's something that you'll see in Ansible as well as the information, data, facts about our nodes and environment can be stored using YAML, so that's something they have in common. YAML, though, really is ingrained into the core of Ansible versus Puppet, where it's been more of an add-on than anything. If we look at Puppet, the other thing we have is the concept of manifests. So we have, for example, this site.pp file here, which is basically declaring what modules are going to be run against which nodes. And in this case, this is setting up some default modules. These modules will be run against basically the default or all nodes in the environment. This is what Puppet might look like, kind of as a point of comparison. So our Ansible Tower install has finished up. So we'll kind of switch gears and continue on with Puppet, or continue on with Ansible. All right, so we've got, if we look at, kind of take a breath here, where are we at with our installation? So we have Ansible Tower installed. We have 2 Windows clients configured. We've added users. We've set up WinRM listeners. We also have 2 RHEL systems in the environment. Go back over here. I'm already logged into these systems. These tabs. Now, in terms of connections between Ansible and RHEL systems, typically it's done using SSH. And because these are Amazon EC2 instances, I can leverage the EC2 user, which has already deployed into these, and the SSH key, which is already deployed with the virtual machines. So since I have a copy of the private key, I can use that private key with Tower, and kind of what this allows us to do is deploy a RHEL VM, and because the keys are already deployed with that virtual machine, add the appropriate private key to Ansible Tower. Ansible Tower can then connect to that system with no modification. So really, in terms of prep for a RHEL system, there really is none. Once you have the SSH keys deployed, and the other point is that your EC2-user already is set up with sudo privileges. So that's really the 2 things we need. We need to be able to SSH to the system, and our user needs to be able to sudo to root without a password. That's already set up out of the box with EC2 and our EC2 user. So we'll leverage that user account with Ansible Tower. Right. All right, so let's open the Ansible Tower Web UI, and by default, it does use a self-signed certificate. However, during the installation of Ansible Tower, you can specify your own certificates, so that use certs that are signed by a public CA or maybe your own internal CA that you got the certs integrated into your browser, trusted by your browsers already. Today, I'm just using self-signed certs. So the first step once you have Ansible Tower installed is to log into the web user interface. Now, I logged in using the credentials, the password, the username and password that I specified in the inventory file. So if we go back here to our Ansible Tower system, look at our inventory file, parameters here, admin password. So user's a default account called admin, and that's the password that I set for it during the install. Now, Ansible Tower does require a license file to run. You can request a free trial, and there's a here request license button. We can click, complete some information, and Red Hat will send you a license file. If you already have a Red Hat account, I can go ahead and put my Red Hat ID information. And Ansible Tower will retrieve the licenses that are associated with my Red Hat account. Today, I'm actually going to use a license file. Go ahead and just do that. Click submit. Right, so this is the web user interface for Ansible Tower. Ansible Tower does have a full API and command line interface tools. Most people probably use Ansible Tower, especially when they're getting started, via the web user interface. So that's what we're gonna focus on today. But everything that we're doing in the web user interface can be done programmatically via the API or the CLI tools. So keep that in mind. And actually, once you get into more complex use cases and integrating Tower into your environment, using the API, is certainly an option. Something that I've done during on behalf of clients. So keep that in mind, that the option's there if you want to do so. So to get started with Ansible Tower, this first thing we have is a dashboard that shows us basically what's going on, what jobs have been run, and this will start to look more interesting once we've configured connections to these clients and actually run some jobs. So we'll come back and revisit the dashboard. There is a settings page that allows us to do things like configure authentication. So Ansible Tower does support authentication via common enterprise mechanisms, so things like Azure, OAuth, LDAP, Radius, SAML. It has a wide range of options in terms of integrating with your enterprise authentication infrastructure. We're also able to configure things like defaults for the jobs that run in our environment. These are defaults that are applied across all jobs. So I'll go ahead and actually add one. Basically, this allows us to control the system. Oops, wrong jobs. Clicked on the wrong one. Here we go. So this allows us to set variables, for example, across all jobs. An example here, one we might set. Really, though, out of the box, just to get started with Ansible Tower, there's really, once you set your inventory file, set your basic passwords, run the setup script. That's really all that has to be done. But there are options in here that you can take advantage of, more complex deployments. So when we look at Ansible Tower, there's a couple of objects that we need to be familiar with. First of all, the base one object that we're going to need pretty much with every use case is what we call a credential. A credential is something like an SSH key, could be a username, password. Basically, it is it's a definition that Ansible can use to connect to that Windows client. So what username and password, for example, to connect to that Windows system, or what SSH key to connect to those Linux boxes. So for Ansible to do that, we have to store them somewhere, right? We have to tell Ansible what SSH key to use. So let's go ahead and do that. So Ansible Tower supports a number of different credential types, and you can see here things like GitHub credentials, AWS, HashiCorp vaults. There's a wide range of different types of credentials that Ansible Tower can store. In this case, actually, we want a machine credential, so let's go ahead and that off, search. So as I mentioned, we're going to leverage the default user account that is available with EC2 instances. So EC2 user is our username. Copy paste the private key. There's other options here that you can set if needed to sudo, for example. Additional options, parameters. Those can all be set. And let's go ahead, while we're here, let's go ahead and create the credentials for our Windows systems. And in this case, we're just going to use a simple username password. Now, notice that Ansible Tower did encrypt the password. So once we put the password in and click Save, there's no way to retrieve the password in clear text. So Ansible Tower does, those things that I would consider a secure tool. Obviously, if we are using certificates and that sort of thing, there's other ways we would, for example, copy paste our signed certificates in below, but we could use username and passwords and feel pretty secure that they're no one's going to be able to retrieve the plain text version. we've got our 2 credentials set up here for Linux and Windows clients. The next thing we need to do is we need to tell Ansible Tower, all right, what systems are out there in the environment. Ansible Tower supports a number of different ways to tell Ansible basically what clients are in the environment. One way we can do is we can manually add clients to the system, and we might want to do this, for example. Create the inventory here, and we can manually add systems. And that's really all it takes to get started with Ansible Tower. So once we have a credential and a host in the system, I can then actually jump straight to running commands. Ansible Tower supports the ability to run commands in an ad hoc manner against clients. Now, really the goal with most implementations is to, put your configuration, your day 1, your day 2 tasks in code, and use those we call playbooks in Ansible speak, but use those Ansible playbooks to configure the environment, right? And that way those things would be stored in source code control, the parameters, and we have everything locked down. However, it's still useful from time to time to be able to run commands in an ad hoc manner against the system. So we can do that using the Ansible Tower Web UI. There's a module here, and Ansible uses the concept of modules. Different modules are basically pre-built packages inside Ansible that we can use to do different tasks. So things for there's one called service that allows us to configure services on a client system. We might configure RPM packages using Yum. We can actually run shell commands. In this case, though, I'm going to use a module called ping. The ping module is going to connect to our client and just confirm it's there. Basically, connect to it, authenticate to it, and verify that we have good connectivity to that client and that our authentication mechanism is working. And if we go here, everything's green. The result code is success, and the ping module returns what you're looking for is ping and pong. Kind of a little, joke there. But that's all it takes to really get started with Ansible Tower. And from here, I can actually, if you really wanted to, we can continue to run different jobs, different commands. Say shell command, you could run ls of root. Notice machine credentials. I'm picking the credential that I created just a moment ago that contains the SSH key for the EC2 user. All right, so that's the output of our command. So we have our directory listing and just the ID command. So just an example. If we look at more complex use cases, though, as I said, the goal really here should be infrastructure as code, and the way we do that is with, writing we call Ansible Playbooks. Those playbooks we then store in Git Repository. So I put together some playbooks for the demo today. This is the Git Repository that we're looking at. This is the contents of the repository that I'm going to be pulling down. It actually has 2 branches. We'll be using the develop branch today. And the playbooks that we're going to be looking at look like this. So are mostly YAML files. YAML is one of those kind of love it or hate it type file formats. It is picky in terms of indentation, but it is actually, once you get the hang of YAML, it is much easier than other alternatives. It's certainly easier than using something like XML. It is much more powerful than a flat INI type format. So YAML is really at the heart. YAML type configuration files are at the heart of Ansible. So if you're working with Ansible, you're certainly going to need to learn YAML. Once you get the hang of it, it's a very powerful tool. It is easy to use. Some of the advantages of YAML over things like XML is the readability of the YAML for other the people, the admins that come behind you, or the administrators that other people on your team. YAML is called human readable. It doesn't have a lot of extra stuff and characters that aren't really useful for us humans. Instead, it is, we can look at it, we can tell the format of the file just based on the indentation, and we can just read the file. So in this case, I've got a playbook called configure rel system .yml, and you'll see YML or YAML used as file extensions for YAML. In this case, I use the shorter version. And what are we looking at here? Well, okay, so we've got something called hosts all, 3 sections here, 2 for host all, 1 for something called tag app Apache. We have some things called tasks. We're setting facts, and then we've got some include statements here, and some more, things called include roles. We'll take a look at that in more detail about what that means. I want to give you kind of a taste of what the playbooks look like. So how do we connect? How does Ansible Tower access this Git repository? Well, we do that via what we call a project. So create what we call create a new project, that our SCM type to Git, copy paste, or we come and get our Git URL here. So where's that Git URL going to come from? It's going to come from right here. In this case, I am going to use the develop branch, and oh, well, guess what? I haven't created. So one of the steps that I didn't do, and you'll run into this, is okay. How does Ansible needs to begin? We have to tell Ansible everything, right? It's kind of dumb out of the box, right? It's just a computer, it's just a program, so we have to configure it. And one of the things that, as we're, in addition to machine credentials that we need to create, or we call need to create a credential to connect to this Git repo, because it is a private repo. If the repo had been public, that you can skip that step, but in this case, it is a private repo, so we need to create a credential first. Credential type. So it's not a machine credential. In this case, it's what we call source role type. Copy paste in. And the next thing I need to do is I've created a deploy key for this repository. Go ahead and set the username to Git, which is the convention. Copy paste in my deploy key. Notice it encrypted the key. Now we can go back to projects and we create the project. All right, here's our Git credentials. There's various options here, and there's each of these has a help, a question mark you can click on. They're actually pretty helpful in Ansible Tower. So if you, and I don't remember every option, but if I don't, if I need a reminder, click on the question mark here. Typically, with when we're setting up a project for Git, a lot of times you'll want to check this update revision on launch option, and what this basically tells Ansible to do is update the Git, the clone. Remember, it's going to clone this source code from GitHub to the Ansible Tower system. So by checking this box, Ansible Tower will update the repository, basically do a Git pull before each time you launch a job using this. Now, you can set a timeout. So let's say you don't want to do it every time, but maybe you want to do it if more than 60 seconds have gone by. Set the cache timeout value. So I think that's set to 0 for now. All right. So looks like I've made a typo somewhere. So notice this red exclamation mark. Ansible Tower, one of the I consider a user-friendly feature is that it tells you if there's a problem, and it'll show you whether it's green or red. And in this case, I've let's see here. What did I do wrong? Oh, yeah. The SCM URL needs to be a little bit different. So this is the HTTPS version. Since I'm using SSH to connect, I need to use this syntax. We need to use this syntax, which is basically the SSH type syntax.
Recording is on.
All right, so notice it's green, so it identified the problem, that it couldn't successfully clone the repo. It indicated that to me in the web user interface. I was then able to correct it. And if we look at our, schedule, if we look at the, go ahead and click the working button here, this will tell it to relaunch, currently running, green, so that tells me it was able to clone the code. So each time Ansible Tower clones the code, it runs that as a job, that process is what we call a job. So we can go back here into our job section. For example, I was trying to do some troubleshooting. I could go in here and look at the error message, talk about invalid user credentials, authentication failed. I could use that information to help troubleshoot the problem. In this case, though, last time we ran it, everything's fine, green, okay, so we're good to go. So we have now a basic inventory. We have some code. How do we put the two together? We put that together with what we call a template. And a template tells Ansible Tower basically how to combine, what host, what content to put together, and how to, and then how are we going to execute this job. So I've selected what inventory. This is our manual Linux inventory where I went and manually entered a host project. This is our Git repo. I've then picked a playbook. So in the Git repository, if we come back over here and look at the contents of it, it's showing me the playbook files that are in the top level of that repository. So I have a playbook file called debug Ansible client. This is what we're going to run the first time. I'm going to run a task called task test client connection.yaml. We look at that file, tasks subdirectory. It is going to run here. The playbook, basically the tasks, the steps that are going to be executed by Ansible Tower. I've told it what credentials to use, so what, in this case, what SSH key. There's some options. Typically, we leave this at 0, but if you are having problems, they set this to 3. It's pretty common to get more debug, basically output information. So I'll go ahead and set that to debug, just a demonstration here, and then we can launch the job. Now, when you click the launch button, Ansible Tower will take you to basically a live view of that job that's running. It shows you the status in the top left. In this case, running. It shows you the start time, and this is the job running in real time. And in this case, the job has ran and is finished. And everything looks okay. This job wasn't making any changes. It was just doing things. If we go back, what was this job doing? Well, it was, testing. First of all, it was looking at doing a check. It was looking at whether the OS is Red Hat or Windows. And if it was Red Hat, it then runs a task called ping, then runs using the ID module, runs the ID command, and displays the output of that command. Just some basic, again, kind of debug information. If I run this against a Windows client, I need to use some slightly different modules. So instead of the ping module, use the win ping _ping module. And the way that's accomplished is via this win statement. So, Ansible, there's a lot of options and features within the playbooks and within the task files. So, Ansible supports conditionals. So this win conditional. So basically, run this block when this evaluates to true. Run this block when OS family equals Windows. So you can use these conditionals. And there's a full complement of conditional options. You can use negatives that you can get into some pretty complex decision making if needed. Now the goal though should be to keep the playbooks as simple as possible. But if you need to make if you have a complex requirement or use case, Ansible, the power is there with Ansible to solve pretty much any problem you want to, that you need to. So I've showed you, this is kind of a very basic. This is, add a client manually, add an SSH key, run a debug playbook. So what does it look like more kind of a real world scenario? Well, first of all, adding clients manually one by one by one can work, but it doesn't scale to hundreds, thousands of clients. So Ansible has the ability to pull in inventories from external sources dynamically. If we go ahead and create one. We'll go ahead and create a new inventory. And this one, instead of, previously I clicked on host and I clicked the plus button and entered the host name. Instead of doing that, I'm going to click source over here. I'm going to add a new source to choose Amazon EC2 here. Regions, I'm going to set US. Are these systems happen to be in Ohio? I'm going to add a filter, US equals rel. This just helps limits what EC2 instances are returned by this job. And I've got to add one more thing. Grab it here. Save that job. Save that source. Once it's saved, click here to start the sync process. Okay, so the job's finished. So now we can come back to our dynamic inventory on hosts. And let's see here. Typo. It's a great example of why we want to get away from ad hoc administration of systems. It's so easy to make a typo when you're in a hurry, trying to move quickly. Fingers don't quite work like you want them to, and an extra letter here broke our process. Right. So now this source job that I created, EC2, pulled in dynamically, queried the EC2 API. It did it using a tag OS equals rel. And a couple of these parameters basically help or configure the job. Actually, configure the job that's running kind of under the covers. So a couple options that are needed, and that job pulled in 2 hosts. So here's our 2 hosts. Repeat that again for Windows. Then we'll pull it all together. So it is certainly possible to pull in all of the hosts, Linux and Windows with one job here. I'm choosing to separate them out because with Ansible, many of the modules, basically there's a set of modules that work with Linux and there's a set of modules that work with Windows. And because of that, the playbooks tend to be fairly different from, between the two. There's some commonality, at some level, but when you get into configuring the operating system, for example, there's a lot of differences. So it ends up becoming easier to go ahead and separate out our Windows versus rel systems at the top level, basically, versus creating one inventory that contains all of the hosts and having to kind of separate them out or limit what hosts or what jobs run against which hosts later on process. This ends up being a bit cleaner. So Windows host, if we look at our host here, we should have 2. All right, great. So we've got this we call dynamic inventories. Now these inventories typically, when we look at it in a real world, what we would do is schedule this, for example, you can schedule this to rerun every so often. Might rerun it every 4 hours, every day, depends how often you run, how often you add nodes to your environment. You can also rerun it each time a job launches if you want to. Probably a little bit of an overkill, but certainly the options are there. So if we come back to templates now, we can now create a more sophisticated template that basically to do more work. And if we look at, call this one LOS Fig, our inventory, check our inventory. So we want to do dynamic inventory. Project, pull in our code. Playbook. So here we're going to configure RHEL systems, credentials, clients. Right. Now, one of the things that we need to make sure, because we're actually going to be, this playbook modifies the system. We come back over here. This is one of the systems, and notice that the host name of the system is the default AWS host name. It's going to change the host name. So we need to enable privilege escalation. This is going to allow the playbook to sudo the job, to sudo to root. Go ahead and launch that. That's running. We'll come right back to that. Create one more. Just about out of time, so the process is going to be very similar for our Windows systems. I'm going to pick a different playbook. This playbook is focused on Windows type operations or configuration. And with Windows, we do not need to enable privilege escalation because we're using a user. We're logging into that system with a user that already has admin privileges. Go ahead and launch that job. So if we come back here in our dashboard, show you the dashboard. We have some jobs running now. It shows us what recently run jobs, what templates we've run. We get overview of our hosts. Up here gives us an inventory of all the hosts across all of our inventories. Go back to jobs. LLS config. And this is running. This is going to take a little while because it's actually doing a yum update, and there happens to be some packages that it needs to install. But if we look here, we can see that the playbook has already changed the name of the host system, so should be successful all the way through. All right. So I guess to kind of wrap things up, wanted to see if there's any questions. From anyone on the call. Certainly take some time, take some questions. The other thing we want to talk about, kind of pull this together, what are our key takeaways? Ansible is easy to use. I was able to, install Ansible from basically a, default VM, right? And the only thing I had done is run yum update beforehand. And even that I didn't have to do. So basically I go through, install Ansible, and have dynamic, pull in clients dynamically and run jobs against those clients, in maybe 45 minutes or less. So it's very quick. And, I think there was a quote that I found the other day, or just a few days ago, that I read about Ansible. I think that sums it up. Ansible automation platform, it drives orchestration, configuration management, and governance at an enterprise scale. So that's really, I think, the key takeaway about Ansible. Zone door group. So, please let us know if you have any questions about Ansible automation platform. We have a large group of people, consultants on staff, one of the largest benches of Ansible consultants in the country. So I'd be happy to help you with your Ansible project. We have we call it Ansible Migration Accelerator, which is basically kind of a prepackaged offering that can help you get up to speed with Ansible and help you replace those legacy tools. And again, we'd be happy to chat with you about your use cases, what you have going on. Go from there. So Mike Savage, maybe turn it back over to you for.
Yes, thank you, Mike. That was excellent. I've unmuted the mics in case there are any questions. Also, while we have the questions coming, make sure you check the chat. Jamie put in a link to our November raffle for a chance to win a branded Red Hat Polo and a $50 Amazon gift card. So make sure you get there and enter in for that raffle. So with that, any questions from the participants? Okay. Well, I would really like to thank Stone Door Group and Mike McDonough for leading our Red Hat Open demo today, showcasing our Ansible automation platform. Really great stuff. Make sure you check back into our Red Hat Open Demos calendar for the next scheduled demo. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.